And that's when everything went sideways. My name is Roy Hutchinson. I'm 53 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I was sitting in the boardroom of one of the biggest deals my firm had ever put together. Today, I'm going to tell you how a handshake, or the lack of one, cost a Fortune 500 company more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. But first, let me back up and explain how I ended up in that room in the first place. I wasn't born into this business. My dad was an electrician in Detroit, worked the auto plants for 35 years before retiring when his back started giving him trouble. Mom cleaned office buildings downtown, came home every night with stories about the executives she'd see working late in their glass offices. She always said those people weren't any smarter than us. They just had different opportunities. I believed her, made it my mission to prove it. Dad used to take me to the plant sometimes on weekends when he had maintenance work. I'd watch him troubleshoot electrical systems that kept the assembly lines running. He never talked down to the engineers when they asked questions. Never acted like his work was less important than theirs. He taught me that every job matters, and every person deserves respect regardless of what they do for a living. Roy, he'd say, there's no such thing as unimportant work. There's just work done by people who get treated like they're unimportant. That stuck with me. Got a scholarship to Michigan State, studied finance while working nights at a warehouse loading trucks. The warehouse job taught me as much as my classes did. Saw how the office guys treated the floor workers, how they talked about them when they thought nobody was listening. Made mental notes about the kind of boss I never wanted to become. After graduation, spent 10 years climbing the ladder at other people's firms, learning how the money really moves in this country. Learned something else too, how the old boys club treats guys like me, the ones without the right last names or the right prep school connections. I'd sit in meetings where ideas got credited to whoever had the most expensive tie, where deals got made on golf courses I couldn't afford to join, but I was learning, watching, taking notes. During those years, I saw what happens when money gets treated like an entitlement instead of a responsibility. Watched companies get destroyed by executives who thought their titles made them untouchable. Saw good workers lose their jobs because some MBA wanted to impress Wall Street with his cost-cutting skills. The breaking point came during a deal I was working on in my 9th year. Mid-size manufacturing company, solid fundamentals, employing about 800 people in Ohio. The CEO was a decent guy. Built the company from scratch over 20 years. But he needed capital to expand, and the investors we brought in had other ideas. 6 months after the deal closed, they'd fired the CEO and laid off 300 workers, moved production to Mexico, kept the profits in New York. The local newspaper ran pictures of families cleaning out their lockers, people who'd worked there for decades, suddenly looking for jobs that didn't exist anymore. I'd helped make that happen. I'd done the financial analysis that justified those layoffs. The math was clean. The profits were real, but the cost was paid by people who never got a vote in the decision. That night, I called my dad. I think I made a mistake, I told him. What kind of mistake? He asked. I explained the deal, the layoffs, how the numbers worked, but the people got crushed. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Son, you can't undo what's done, but you can decide what kind of man you want to be going forward." 2 weeks later, I walked away from that firm. Took what I'd saved, found a small office above a dental practice in a strip mall, and started Hutchinson Capital Management. The pitch was straightforward. We write big checks, we stay out of your day-to-day operations. But the cost of that freedom is very specific behavior when it matters. The first few years were tough. Small deals, smaller profits, lots of nights eating ramen noodles and wondering if I'd made the right choice. But word travels in the finance world. Companies started hearing about a firm that actually cared about more than just quarterly returns. Investors got tired of seeing their money used to destroy the very businesses they were supposed to be helping. We developed a reputation, careful due diligence, fair terms, and one unusual requirement that made lawyers nervous and executives curious, the conduct provision. Every deal included language that allowed us to walk if senior leadership engaged in behavior that materially damaged the company's reputation during negotiations. Most lawyers tried to talk their clients out of agreeing to it. Most executives signed anyway, figuring they could behave themselves long enough to close a deal.
Most of them were right. Howard Blackstone wasn't, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
let me tell you about the deal that brought us together and how a man who thought he was putting me in my place ended up costing his company $1.2 billion. Northbridge Holdings came to us during what they politely called a strategic transition period. That's corporate speak for we're in serious trouble and need cash yesterday. They were a decent company on paper, logistics, manufacturing, some tech services that actually worked, but they'd grown too fast and borrowed too much during the good times. When the market turned in 2022, companies like Northbridge found themselves in what bankers politely call a liquidity challenge. Translation, they owed more money than they could pay back, and the banks that used to return their calls were suddenly very busy with other clients. Their board was bringing in a new CEO, Vincent Crawford, a sharp guy in his early 40s with a decent track record at smaller companies, but Crawford inherited a mess. The previous CEO had spent 5 years buying companies like they were collectible cards, leveraging the balance sheet to fund acquisitions that looked good in PowerPoint but never quite delivered the synergies that justified their price tags. By the time we got involved, Northbridge needed two things: fresh capital and a leadership reset. We could provide the first, the second was up to them. We structured the deal carefully. $1.2 billion commitment staged over 18 months tied to specific performance milestones and governance reforms. The money would come in tranches as the company hit targets for debt reduction, operational efficiency, and management accountability. And then there was my insurance policy. The conduct provision, my lawyer, Sarah Chen, had refined the language over several deals. It was deceptively simple. If during negotiations or closing, any documented conduct by senior leadership materially harmed the reputational standing of the company or its incoming leadership, Hutchinson Capital could withdraw its commitment immediately. No penalty, no delay, no renegotiation rights. Capital off the table, deal dead. You're being paranoid. Sarah told me when I first insisted on including it. These are professionals. They're not going to do anything stupid while you're watching. They're human beings, I replied. And human beings reveal who they really are when they think nobody important is watching. I'd learned that lesson the hard way 5 years earlier. A $600 million injection into a regional infrastructure firm. Good company, solid management, clean financials. Everything looked perfect until 3 days before closing, when a video surfaced of the chairman publicly humiliating a line worker during a safety meeting, called him expendable labor in front of the man's coworkers, laughed when others laughed. We should have walked. Instead, I let my partners convince me it was a one-time incident, that the chairman was having a bad day, that walking away over a personality conflict would damage our reputation for reliability. We closed the deal within 6 months. That video was Exhibit A in every labor dispute, every regulatory hearing, every negative news story about the company. The chairman's attitude trickled down through management, creating a toxic culture that drove away good employees and attracted regulatory scrutiny. We got our returns eventually, but the cost in time, energy, and reputation management wasn't worth the profit. I promised myself it wouldn't happen again. So when Northbridge's lawyers tried to negotiate out the conduct provision, I held firm. This isn't optional, I told them during a conference call. Character matters as much as cash flow, maybe more. They agreed, probably figuring their leadership was professional enough to behave themselves during a few board meetings. Howard Blackstone, the chairman, signed off without even reading the clause carefully. That would turn out to be expensive. The final board meeting was supposed to be ceremonial. Sign papers, shake hands, announce the partnership to investors and employees. They'd arranged for a live stream, multiple camera angles, professional lighting. Transparency in action, their communications team called it. I flew into Chicago the morning of the meeting, changed clothes in the airport lounge, took a car straight to Northbridge's downtown headquarters. The building was all glass and steel, the kind of place designed to impress visitors and intimidate competitors. The lobby featured a stock ticker, promotional videos of smiling workers, and enough marble to build a small monument. The receptionist gave me a practiced smile. "Welcome to Northbridge. Your name, please." "Roy Hutchinson. I'm here for the board meeting." Her hands paused over the keyboard for just a moment. Then she typed, smiled again, and said, "Of course, Mr. Hutchinson. Someone from Investor Relations will be down shortly." That pause told me everything I needed to know. She'd been expecting someone else. Someone more impressive, maybe. someone who looked like their usual idea of a managing partner. Carlos Rivera from Investor Relations appeared a few minutes later. Young guy, expensive suit, nervous energy. He made small talk in the elevator about the weather and the traffic while sneaking glances at the folder under my arm and the flowers I was carrying. The flowers had been his idea, actually. The event coordinator wanted the boardroom to look welcoming and celebratory for the cameras. White lilies and eucalyptus, nothing fancy. They'd asked me to bring them up when I arrived, save the caterers a trip. Big day today, Rivera said as we rode up to the executive floor. For who? I asked. He laughed uncertainly. For everyone, I guess. Lots of eyes on this meeting. The executive floor was quieter than the lobby. All thick carpet and hushed conversations. Framed photos lined the hallways. Previous CEOs shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at factory openings, standing in front of facilities that had probably been sold years ago to fund the next acquisition. Rivera led me to a set of double-glass doors with cameras mounted above them. For the webcast, he explained when he saw me notice them. Chairman Blackstone wants full transparency. I thought about the conduct provision. Good, I said. The boardroom looked like someone had ordered Successful Corporation from a catalog. Long polished table, high-backed leather chairs, one wall of windows overlooking the city, the opposite wall lined with screens ready for presentations. In the corner, on a credenza, sat a matching set of flowers identical to the ones I was carrying. I can take those, Rivera offered, reaching for my flowers. I've got them, I said. Several people were already seated around the table. Howard Blackstone held court at the head, mid-60s with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Vincent Crawford, the incoming CEO, sat about halfway down, flipping through a presentation deck with the focused intensity of someone trying to memorize his lines. Simon Martinez, the CFO, was reviewing documents at his laptop. A few other board members were making small talk, checking phones, settling into their roles for what everyone expected to be a smooth, scripted performance. Nobody introduced me. Nobody asked my name. They saw the flowers in my hand, my position near the door, my lack of an assigned seat, and they made their assumptions. I walked around the table toward Crawford, the flowers balanced in one arm, my briefcase in the other hand. The cameras were already rolling, red lights blinking in the corners like electronic eyes. This was being broadcast live to investors, employees, probably analysts and reporters who covered the industry. Crawford looked up as I approached. He had tired eyes, the kind that come from too many late nights preparing for moments like this. First-time CEO of a major company, knowing that every word and gesture would be analyzed, dissected, turned into headlines. I set the flowers down at the edge of the table, freeing my hand and extended it toward him. Congratulations on the appointment, Vincent, I said. I'm Roy Hutchinson. Before Crawford could move, Howard Blackstone's head swiveled our way. He took in the scene, my outstretched hand, Crawford's surprised expression, the flowers I'd just placed on his precious table. His eyes moved from my hand to my face, and I saw the exact moment he decided I didn't belong in his world. It wasn't personal, it was automatic. A reflex built over decades of sorting people into categories, important and unimportant, worthy of respect and beneath notice. I don't do business with the help, he said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, loud enough for every microphone to catch, loud enough for the live stream to broadcast to anyone watching. The reaction was immediate and predictable. A couple of board members chuckled, that nervous laughter people make when they're uncomfortable but don't want to be the first to object. Someone at the far end of the table muttered something to his neighbor. The communications director in the back corner covered his mouth, but I could see his shoulders shaking. Crawford looked at my outstretched hand, then at Blackstone, then down at the table. He had a choice to make right there, in front of the cameras, in front of his new board. He could take my hand, acknowledge me as a professional, maybe even correct his chairman's assumption. He chose to stare at his agenda instead. I kept my hand extended for a few more seconds, feeling the room's energy shift around me. Straightened my cufflinks with my free hand, the familiar click of metal against metal, helping me stay calm, while everyone waited to see if I'd gotten the message. I'm here as requested, I said, keeping my voice level professional. Then stand where you're told. Blackstone replied, leaning back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. This meeting is for executives. I lowered my hand slowly, on my own terms, not his, walked to the empty chair at the far end of the table and sat down. No nameplate, no welcome packet, no acknowledgement that I was anything more than hired help who'd overstepped his bounds. Perfect. Let's begin, Blackstone announced, turning toward the main screen like nothing had happened. The first slide appeared. Northbridge Holdings. Strategic partnership and leadership transition. He launched into his prepared remarks with the smooth confidence of someone who'd never had his assumptions challenged. Talked about historic partnerships and strategic capital. Mentioned shared vision and aligned interests. Used a lot of corporate buzzwords that sounded impressive and meant nothing. He never mentioned Hutchinson Capital by name, never acknowledged the $1.2 billion commitment that was making this whole presentation possible. As far as his narrative was concerned, the money had just materialized out of thin air, attracted by his brilliant leadership and the company's obvious potential. I listened. I watched. I took mental notes about who laughed at his jokes, who nodded when he made eye contact, who seemed comfortable with his performance, and who looked like they wished they were somewhere else. Simon Martinez, the CFO, kept glancing my way. He had the look of an accountant who'd found a discrepancy in the books, but couldn't quite put his finger on what was wrong. Smart guy, detail-oriented, probably the only person in the room who'd actually read every word of our agreement. Patricia Lawson, the lead independent director, sat quietly near the middle of the table. Former labor lawyer, according to her bio, someone who'd built her career fighting for workers' rights before moving into corporate governance. She wasn't laughing at Blackstone's jokes after about 10 minutes of corporate theater. I decided it was time to introduce a little reality into the proceedings. Before you go any further, I said, my voice cutting through Blackstone's momentum, there's something you should know. The room went quiet. Blackstone stopped mid-sentence and turned toward me with that same amused expression he'd worn during the handshake incident. We're not taking input from staff during this presentation, he said, his tone mixing condescension with mock patience. You can give your comments to investor relations afterward. If you're refusing to shake my hand, I said, still calm, still professional, then by tomorrow morning $1.2 billion will no longer be part of this deal. The silence that followed wasn't the dramatic gasp you hear in movies. It was deeper than that. It was the sound of assumptions cracking, of comfortable narratives suddenly becoming very uncomfortable questions. Someone laughed nervously. All right, that's enough drama, a board member said, trying to restart the script. Let's stay focused on the presentation. Blackstone leaned back in his chair, his smile never wavering. Capital arrangements are handled through proper channels, he said. We don't negotiate with delivery personnel. I am the proper channel, I replied. That's when Simon Martinez cleared his throat. He'd been scrolling through documents on his tablet during this entire exchange, cross-referencing signatures and authorization levels. The pieces were clicking together in his accountant's brain. Before we continue, Martinez said carefully, we need to confirm final authorization from our capital provider. The release documents require direct signatory approval. Legal handles those details. Blackstone snapped, annoyed at the interruption. From the managing partner, Martinez corrected, looking directly at me. The person with signature authority over the commitment. You could feel the shift in the room's energy. Papers rustled. Chairs creaked. People started paying attention to details they'd ignored 5 minutes earlier. That would be me, I said simply. For the first time since I'd walked into that boardroom, Howard Blackstone really looked at me. Not at my clothes or my perceived position in his hierarchy, but at my face, at my eyes, at the possibility that his assumptions might have been expensively wrong. You're saying you control the funding? Blackstone asked slowly, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. I'm saying I'm Roy Hutchinson, managing partner of Hutchinson Capital Management, authorized to deploy or withdraw our $1.2 billion commitment to this partnership. The word withdraw settled over the room like a cold front. Martinez nodded once, confirming what his research had told him. He's listed as sole signatory on all primary capital agreements, he said quietly. Crawford finally found his voice. How much authority are we talking about? All of it, I said. Without Hutchinson Capital's commitment, your remaining funding partners can't proceed as structured. Some won't proceed at all. A board member was frantically scrolling through documents on his tablet. "This isn't what we were briefed," he said. "That's because nobody asked," I replied. Blackstone tried to regain control of his narrative. "This meeting is about final alignment," he said, his tone getting sharper, not surprise introductions. "Final alignment requires mutual respect," I said, "something you demonstrated you're incapable of 15 minutes ago." That's when Martinez brought up the elephant in the room. He'd found the clause everyone else had glossed over during contract review. "There is one item we need to address," he said, his voice careful but clear. "The reputational conduct provision in Section 12. Papers rustled as people started flipping through their copies of the agreement. A director near the middle read aloud, "Any documented conduct by senior leadership that materially harms the reputational standing of the partnership allows for immediate capital withdrawal." Crawford looked up from his document. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means behavior has consequences," I said, "even when you think nobody important is watching." Another board member was studying the language more carefully. "It doesn't require intent," she noted, "just impact and documentation." Blackstone waved dismissively. "Boilerplate language. We include similar clauses in most agreements." "We revised this one specifically," Martinez said, still looking at me. At Hutchinson Capital's explicit request, all eyes turned my way. I straightened my cufflinks again, feeling the familiar texture of the metal, the small satisfaction of precision in a room full of chaos. "Character matters more than contracts," I said. "You can't enforce integrity, but you can choose not to finance its absence." Patricia Lawson spoke up for the first time. "This meeting is being recorded," she said, glancing at the cameras in the corners. "For transparency," Blackstone said, his voice getting tight. "Yes," I agreed. "For transparency." I pulled out my phone and placed it face down on the table. Didn't need to make a call yet. The threat was clear enough. The recess that followed was chaos barely contained by corporate politeness. Board members huddled in corners, whispering urgently into phones. Blackstone disappeared, probably calling lawyers or crisis management consultants. Crawford stood by the windows, watching his career prospects evaporate in real time. Martinez approached me in the hallway during the break. "We should talk privately," he said. "Not here," I replied. "Not now." He nodded, understanding the implications. "I've worked with good companies and bad ones," he said quietly. "This could have been a good one." I walked to a quiet alcove near the elevators and made the call I'd been preparing to make since Blackstone opened his mouth. "Bradley, it's Roy. Execute the withdrawal." My partner Bradley Thompson had been my second in command for 8 years. He could read everything he needed to know in my tone. "Full amount?" he asked. "Full amount. Documented as conduct-related pursuant to Section 12. File immediately with all parties. You're sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything." When I walked back into the boardroom, the energy had shifted from confident to desperate. People were checking phones constantly, getting real-time updates on market reactions to preliminary reports of funding uncertainty. Blackstone tried to restart his presentation, but Martinez's phone buzzed loudly in the middle of his first sentence. "Could we please silence devices?" Blackstone said sharply. Martinez didn't silence his phone. He stared at the screen, and I watched him absorb the reality of what was happening. "The primary commitment," he said slowly, "has been withdrawn." "What does that mean?" Crawford asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Executed." Martinez continued, reading from multiple notifications. "Full amount, $1.2 billion, effective immediately." "That's impossible," a director said. "We have contracts, we have timelines. We had conditions I corrected. You ensured those conditions weren't met." Blackstone stood so abruptly his chair rolled backward. "You can't just pull that kind of capital," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "This board won't stand for this kind of manipulation." "This board doesn't own Hutchinson Capital's money," I replied calmly. "You were being offered access to it under specific conditions. You violated those conditions on camera, in front of your incoming CEO, during a live-streamed board meeting. Phones were buzzing constantly now. Not individual notifications, but a steady stream of calls and messages as the market reacted to breaking news about Northbridge's funding crisis. Pre-market trading. Someone asked, "Down 22% and falling." Came the answer. Crawford buried his face in his hands. You're destroying a company over a handshake? I'm protecting my investors from a leadership culture that thinks public humiliation is acceptable business practice, I said. Companies don't get destroyed by single moments of disrespect. They get destroyed by the attitudes those moments reveal. Patricia Lawson had been quiet through most of this crisis. Now she looked directly at Blackstone. Howard, we need to discuss governance immediately. You're not removing me over one misunderstood comment. Blackstone replied. This isn't one comment, Lawson said. This is a character flaw with a $1.2 billion price tag. What happened next followed corporate protocol exactly. Boards don't stage dramatic revolts. They follow procedures, reference bylaws, make motions, call votes. But underneath the formal language, raw self-preservation was driving every decision. Within 2 hours, Blackstone was placed on administrative leave. Crawford's appointment was suspended pending a complete leadership review. A crisis committee was formed to assess damage and explore reconciliation with capital partners. Lawson found me as the emergency session was breaking up. Is there any way forward? She asked. Not with me, I said. This isn't about money anymore. It's about culture. You built an organization where your chairman thought he could humiliate someone on camera and everyone would laugh along. I won't finance that. The story hit financial news within hours. By evening, it was trending on business social media when arrogance costs $1.2 billion. The handshake that destroyed a Fortune 500 deal. I watched coverage from the airport lounge, waiting for my flight home. 2 analysts were debating investor activism on CNBC. People are too sensitive, one argued. It was just a comment. It was a comment that cost shareholders over $1 billion, the other replied. That's not sensitivity, that's accountability. I called my dad from the plane. Saw your story on the news, he said. That really happened the way they're telling it? Yeah, Dad, it happened. Good for you, he said. Your mother always said you'd show those people someday. She'd be proud. Back at Hutchinson Capital, we were fielding calls from companies wanting to understand our requirements, investors wanting to copy our conduct provisions, journalists wanting the inside story. The clause was being adapted across the industry. A young associate asked me privately, "Won't this make executives nervous about working with us?" Good, I said. If they're worried about treating people with basic respect while cameras are rolling, they're not our kind of partners. 3 days later, I got a text from Crawford. I should have said something in that meeting. I looked at it for a long time before typing back. You had the microphone and the moment. You chose silence. He didn't reply. The thing about respect is it's not complicated. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't require special training. It just requires recognizing that every person deserves basic dignity, regardless of what you assume their role is. Howard Blackstone thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he put himself out of a job and cost his company $1.2 billion, all because he couldn't be bothered to shake hands with someone carrying flowers. People assume power announces itself with titles and corner offices. That day, it walked into a boardroom carrying legal documents and white lilies. They saw what they expected to see and treated me according to assumptions that turned out to be very expensive. The handshake would have been free. The lesson cost them everything. Sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones that teach other people who you really are. And in a room full of cameras, those lessons become permanent records that follow you long after the money is gone. True power isn't about making people fear you. It's about making them respect you. And the difference between those two things is worth exactly what you're willing to lose to maintain your dignity.